The law of large numbers is a statistical principle that tells us that the more data we have available for any given measurement, the closer the average of that data is to the truth. The law of small numbers is a rule I made up for my own amusement. Welcome to the rant.
Der Tod eines Menschen, das ist eine Katastrophe. 100.000 Tote? Das ist eine Statistik. The death of a human being is a catastrophe. 100,000 dead. That is a statistic.
You've probably heard this truism repeated and paraphrased at several points in your life, and its seeming veracity comes from a very common part of human existence, in that our minds are not well trained to consider things in large quantities. It is easy for us to picture a single image in our head, and it's not much strain to picture 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of these same images. At the point of reaching 10, however, things start to lose clarity. You probably start forming the ideas in rows and columns in order to ensure you are imagining the correct number, and at that point, the details of the image are already starting to get lost, which is unfortunate because the details are usually the parts that make us care. Why does this phenomenon occur? I'll be honest, I haven't looked into it. It's not particularly important to this essay. I am going to blame the base 10 numerical system and the wiggly fingers that inspired it, but don't quote me on that. I'm not an academic source. It's not particularly hard to imagine why the number 1 has the most power over the human psyche, as it is, in itself, singular. Everyone relates to the number 1 because they are a 1 themselves. The individual is immediate. All other numbers are external, and therefore distant. Theoretical. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. This, according to René Descartes, is the cornerstone of knowledge. When all else is in doubt, this is the one thing we can hold to be true. While I don't personally agree that this phrase actually solves its intended problem, enough philosophers have been convinced by it that the phrase is still part of our modern lexicon, which isn't something you can say for a lot of Latin. So, old René Descartes must have been onto something. Our individuality is so immediate, apparent, and seemingly self-evident that we can, and often do, use it as the core of all our knowledge, and the basis from which we interact with the rest of reality. This is why much of our understanding of the world is most easily conveyed by the highlighting of specific individuals. Anne Frank was not the only victim of the Third Reich, nor was Adolf Hitler the only aggressor. But our minds more readily process the history surrounding these individuals if we place them at the centre of it. This, in turn, has led to such missteps as great man theory, which generally overemphasises the role of specific individuals in history and elevates them into a grander narrative, legends that diminish the contributions of potentially thousands of other individuals for the sake of a single figurehead. Alexander the Great did not conquer the known world alone, nor did Christopher Columbus fuck up his trip to India without assistance. But there's an appeal to these stories regardless, because they're just simpler. This quirk of historical narrative is not a fluke, mind you. There's appeal in simplicity for all stories, whether fact or fiction. We're in a time where mainstream culture is once again testing the limits of broad, expansive narratives filled with large casts of characters. The difficulty these projects will all inevitably run into as they grow is trying to keep audiences invested in the characters as their time with each of them is spread out more and more thinly. A character can make an excellent first impression, and their basic quirks might appeal initially, but if the narrative does not continue to reveal more of them as time moves forward, casual interest will wane and the fanatics will fill the space with details of their own creation. The audience likes variety, and they'll get easily excited when there's a new toy to play with, but they will only ever fall in love with individual characters. It might just be one, or it could be many, but each character inevitably has to make their case for themselves as individuals. This rule also applies to the stakes of any story. The idea of saving the world has long been mocked as a narrative goal, as it is argued that an entire planet or even just the billions of people who live in it, is too large an idea for any audience member to emotionally attach to. And, as anyone who has read a history book or kept up with the news could tell you, there's certainly real-world evidence for this. This isn't to say that high stakes aren't viable in stories, but their success lies in execution, and are often most successful when paired with or expressed through a threat to individuals. Audiences might not care about the end of a continent, a country, or even a city, but they're susceptible to the fate of a protagonist or an innocent. If you do it well enough, they might be willing to discard the many entirely if it ensured the safety of the few, much as Spock would disapprove. It's a little scuffed, but a storyteller is incentivized to tap into the selfish subconscious of their audience, to abandon logical altruism and prey upon primal, emotional individualism. Again, if you do it well enough, they'll thank you for it. They'll call that good storytelling. I have a similar experience with games. Games, even more than reality, are just a bunch of numbers running into each other and making new, exciting numbers in the process. Once again, I find myself investing more in smaller numbers than larger numbers. Let's take health as an example. A common mechanic of games is to track the character's health in the form of points. Health points. HP for short. There's no standard measure for how many HP any character can have. They may start with 5, or 10, 100, or 1000. There's also no rule on how much a character's health can change as they progress. A game that starts with single-figure health may have that bar balloon into triple figures by the end of the game, or only grow by a few more points. All these factors are adaptable to the game being made, and the experience intended for the player. Health is, however, a more interesting mechanic when it is kept to single digits, at least in my experience. Smaller increments make each of those increments more valuable, and therefore I invest myself more in them. There's also less ambiguity in smaller health values. Health enters a binary state. I either have it or I don't, and it's usually clearer how much danger I'm in. This goes hand in hand with how other elements of a game will be designed in tandem with lower health values. Instances that both remove and restore health are usually more clearly telegraphed and more interactive. Each interaction feels more important when the margins are smaller. Compare this to other games where the numbers can go well into 4, 5, or even 6 figures. This is where numbers truly become meaningless. There is little difference in an attack that deals 1,245 points of damage compared to an attack that deals 998 points of damage when the target's health bar is in the hundreds of thousands. In fact, any health value that exceeds 100 points is, in my mind, an exercise in redundancy. After exceeding this limit, a player is increasingly less likely to be dealing in the true values of their HP and abstracting it down to percentages of their bar. A player is never going to be at 1,800 HP out of 2,000. They're going to be at 95%, and even that's being generous. Most players will default to full health, above half, below half, about to die, and dead. At this point, having an actual number value on the screen is not to anyone's benefit. That's not to say there isn't any mechanical use to these larger numbers. The obvious answer as to why these values can balloon so much is that it provides clear growth. RPGs are designed to constantly drip feed the player characters with small stat increases over the course of the game, and this leads to a clear difference in character power between the start and end of the game. Games that are more cautious with health upgrades are clearly intending for there to be less of a gap in character power over the course of the game, or intending for growth in player skill to accomplish the same result. Another thing to consider is how a game manages progression and upgrades. Single-digit upgrades to health and damage make a big difference when values are low, and can stack up quickly to make characters wildly more powerful. I wouldn't recommend trying to implement upgrades that have a value lower than 1, so if a game requires a more limited or gradual progression system, then larger starting values are much better at allowing that. Similarly, if upgrades want to work off a percentage scaling system rather than raw values, then values higher than single digits are necessary. No one wants to gain a 20% bonus to their 6 HP. Coming back around to threats, video games serve as a decent example for how numbers affect perception of obstacles and enemies. One of the most enduring tropes of video game narratives is the idea of a final boss, a single entity who embodies the greatest challenge to the player characters and the true source of all their problems. This narrative framework was most likely first invented in service of game mechanics and system requirements, albeit with inspiration taken from tales of evil despots and legendary monsters. But I'll be damned if it doesn't make for compelling storytelling. Focusing all of the characters' emotion and motivation onto a single point has a fantastic clarifying effect on the narrative that helps enable audience investment. At the same time, there is the opportunity to raise tension in how dangerous this opponent is for the characters. A general trend of narratives is that increasing the number of enemies or hazards a character faces rarely results in an approximate increase in threat. In fact, the predetermined nature of a narrative means that the level of threat remains consistent regardless of how this value changes. So if the number of enemies increases, the level of threat is then divided among each of these enemies. TV Tropes refers to this narrative quirk as the conservation of ninjutsu, and it matches well with what we see in games. If we see a single enemy alone in a large room, they're probably extremely dangerous. If we see a horde of enemies in a narrow space, they'll likely succumb to anything as strong as a stiff breeze. This is especially noticeable when you see an enemy that was at one point a bespoke encounter used as a basic enemy further down the road. This isn't to say that there is no danger in enemy quantity. There's nothing inherent about horde mode games that would make them easier than boss rushes, but it's safe to say that the average enemy in a horde is almost entirely non-threatening as an individual, and it's only through sheer numbers that they are likely to overwhelm you. But at a certain point, the multitudes melt into a mass, a tide of trouble to be dealt with holistically rather than case by case. And that's usually because there's no meaningful difference in the way you as a player interact with each individual entity, as well as there usually being very little if any visual distinction between them. Because of this, these games will employ special enemies to provide additional threat and spice up the experience, using these enemies' individuality as an opportunity to make them more dangerous than their mass-produced peers. Usually, these threats are identified through unique visual characteristics, size, shape, colour, to differentiate themselves from the fodder, and they provide some difference in mechanical challenge. Player interaction with these rarer units is not inherently more valuable or productive than with the basic units, but their individuality makes them feel more important to the player, even on repeated interactions. When talking about hordes, it seems important to discuss zombies. Zombies have been a staple of pop culture, both in games and other media, for decades now, and they make for fascinating dissection for this particular topic because of how surprisingly flexible they can be. The most common perception of zombies is the roving hordes of faceless undead, swarming down streets and consuming all who fall beneath them. Depending on the tone or progression of your narrative, this horde might be an unstoppable force, their numbers simply too great to hold against, or they might be little more than target practice, mowed down with ease under a hail of gunfire. Likewise, a single zombie in an enclosed area can mean anything from a minor distraction to certain doom. The characters in a zombie narrative may never truly be threatened by the zombies as a collective, but completely undone as soon as they are faced with a monster wearing the face of someone they love. Part of the horror of zombies is this perversion of identity, the physical appearance of a person being puppeteered around by some hostile entity, the individual being lost to the collective. That last point is more point of perception. Scientific zombies induced by infection don't necessarily have any collective trait between them beyond the same general instincts and behaviours, in contrast to magical zombies animated by a person or curse. In fact, compared to hive mind hordes, zombies can barely be counted as a collective at all. But then again, zombies as individuals is a matter of perception, and that idea has long been lost in the court of public opinion. This is especially true in games where the appeal of fighting zombies is the almost explicit permission it gives to discard any empathy for your enemies. That being said, gaming culture has already done much to dehumanize the characters you engage with, especially enemies. This isn't too surprising. A lot of action-based media outside of games tends to treat minor characters as faceless and disposable as well. It's part of how we got to the trope of the protagonist showing a completely different set of moral values when confronting their nemesis than with their unnamed henchmen. It's because there's room for emotional focus when the scene is shared between just two people. It might also be partly because the final confrontation is the only scene where the main character actually engages in dialogue with their opponent, rather than skipping straight to the ass-kicking. And I do have to wonder how you'd manage a classic villain monologue with multiple characters. You could always just have one villain deliver the monologue, but that risks establishing a hierarchy between them and the other villains. If multiple villains are talking, are they having a dialogue, or have they rehearsed the monologue ahead of time so they don't speak over each other? Or are they going round in a circle, yes-anding each other? And how would the main character engage them in a philosophical debate in this situation? It might become quite the task to handle the pacing of such an exchange. You'd have to decide if each villain gets to chip in with their own personal evil perspective, or if one villain provides the rebuttal on behalf of the group each time. Already you can feel the attention being split. This would be so much easier if it was just one guy. You can't vow revenge against an army. You can't have a vaguely erotic moonlit sword fight with an organization. You can't have an entire squad secretly be your long-lost father. Quantity may have a quality all of its own, and variety may be the spice of life, but if you're looking to encourage emotion, to inspire tension, to clearly communicate meaning, you might want to consider condensing and concentrating down to the lowest denominator you can manage. The law of large numbers says that having more integers reveals the truth. The law of small numbers says that having fewer makes you care.